Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And this day, it is January 1st. Happy New Year, everyone. Happy New Year, Kelly. Happy New Year, Nikki.
Happy New Year, Jody.
Happy New Year.
So yeah, it is the new year. We are obviously recording this way back in 2022. But this is the third in a kind of series of special episodes that we're doing to round out 2022 and launch us into the new year. And so the last two episodes, we kind of talked about some work that it was inspiring us and things that we were reading and listening to that maybe kind of will carry with us into the work on this show and our work in general. And this episode is just going to be a smattering of questions and so forth that we've gotten from listeners, questions I have for the two of you, and just the sort of ask us anything type thing. And we'll just get right into it. And then I guess I should say, next week, we'll do a few reruns, give ourselves a little bit of a break. We're taking a breath, and then we've got a whole great slate, and the calendar for the year is getting repopulated, and there's all sorts of great stories coming up and so forth. So let's get right into it with the Ask Kelly, Nikki, and Jody Anything conversation. I'm going to start with actually a pretty meaty question that we got from a few people, which is really interesting, but it was for the two of you, if you could study any other time period or any other field other than the one that you do in history, what would it be?
Oh, this is a really good question. I think that I would want to go back some, but not all the way. I'm very much a 20th century historian, but the 19th century holds so many, not only so many juicy, amazing stories, because this really is a century, as Kelly knows well, where so many of the core fundamental ideas of the U.S. experiment are underway, right? It starts with Thomas Jefferson as president. It ends at the beginning of the industrial age in the United States. It ends with Teddy Roosevelt. So there's so much U.S. history packed in there, but there's also the refounding of the United States in the aftermath of the Civil War. I mean, it is no wonder that there are probably more books that come out on the Civil War every year than just about any other topic in U.S. history. And it's so captivating.
It's the Civil War for me. You had me at Civil War. I feel like when it comes to slavery and the Civil War, it really is my bread and butter. But I feel like, I don't know if I could do... It sounds like a cop-out because I would probably do the 20th century because that's the century I know like second best. Yeah. But if I wasn't picking from the 20th century, I would actually probably do something really crazy and do like pre-colonial Africa. Like for me, it's an era that I teach in my class that my students are most excited about because they know the least. And so they're like, yeah, what were these African kingdoms like before Europeans arrived? What does civilization look like? That to me is really exciting and fun. It's way outside of a American, context. Mm-hmm. But if I can't pick 20th century, I'm going way back, like really far back.
Which class do you fold that into?
So I teach it an introduction to the Black experience. We start with that. And then also in African-American history from the slave trade to the Civil War. Instead of starting with just like the birth of slavery, we still start with like Ghana, Mali, Songhai. We do like Mansa Musa, Sundiata Keita, like all of the great West African rulers.
And what are the seeds that you feel like you're planting, or what do your students pick up on when you teach that stuff that then carries into?
I mean, I wrote an op-ed on this, but I teach the story of the Lion King, which everybody knows sort of the Lion King. And they're like, oh yeah, that's about Shakespeare and Hamlet. And I'm like, no, it's about Sundiata Keita. Like, it's about his leadership. It's about what's happening in West Africa right now. And then I have to get them to even understand, like, it's the Lion King, right? Like, lions are in Africa. Like, the whole story, of course, would have a genesis there and be based off of a real African ruler. But so when they get that, they're like, oh, snap. And then I think when we talk about Mansa Musa and, like, his pilgrimage to Mecca and how he, like, gives away so much gold. He devalues the price of gold for the next 25 years. I mean, they're blown away by sort of the richness and the sophistication of Africa before Europeans are there. And we spend a lot of time looking at African art, which I think is really cool too. And then we talk about, the politics of museums and possession and all of that. It's fun.
That is really cool, especially the politics of museums. I kind of feel like I've become more aware of that in the past decade or so. And so every time I go into a museum, I'm just like, you stole all this.
Yeah.
This is the scene of a heist.
Stolen.
Yeah.
I know it's bad. Some stuff is going back, but it's a long process before they finally get back there.
And someone, I think we mentioned this on the previous episode, but someone had shouted out that podcast, Stuff the British Stole, as a show that gets into that kind of stuff. So, Nikki, since Kelly kind of opened the door to going overseas, any other parts of the world that you feel like you would potentially, in an alternate life or maybe a future life, you'd find yourself studying?
Well, I certainly would have to pick up languages in order to study the places that I find interesting. Like, I find Vietnam fascinating. I find France fascinating. And I would love to study those areas, but it is well outside of my kin as somebody who doesn't have a strong facility for languages. I think if I weren't studying political history in the U.S., I would probably just be in another field entirely. I was a latecomer to history as a profession. And so, I had imagined myself being an environmental scientist, or writing had been a really big part of my life. So whether it was creative writing or journalism, I would probably just be in another field altogether.
Same. I was a journalism major, so it seemed like the next best step for me would be to sort of, I've found a way in my career to make a hybrid of the two, history and journalism. But I don't know, if I wasn't doing that, I'd probably work for the State Department. Like one of my friends does it. I think her job is so cool, and I would be all in.
Kelly would be a spy.
Oh, you'd be a great spy.
I don't know about that now. I don't know if I passed the background check.
You got it down. You got the denial down. So,
that's right.
It's funny, I suppose when you're saying, like, okay, what other period would you study in American history? I mean, if you really take the broad sweep of things, you only have, there's 3 centuries, basically. You get to be 20th, I guess now we're 21st century as well. Neither of you, though, said,
period.
Neither of you said 18th century or pre-colonial. But one last question on this front. I don't even know if this is, but can you, clock a historian when you meet them? Like, oh, you're probably a 20th century historian, or you're probably a pre-colonial historian. Are there sort of stereotypes about them?
Oh man,
are there? I mean, I don't really think there are, except for there may be an antiquarian presentism divide, but it is not always immediately evident by laying your eyes on someone and suddenly being like, oh, yep, 17th century probably.
Yeah,
that tracks.
French.
It's not like at the conferences, you can see the 17th century folks hanging off in the corner, and you're like, oh yeah.
I haven't seen. I do think this. I do have a theory. It doesn't always work. That most people are who they study, so that there are a lot of scholars where you think about their book, you're like, oh yeah, that's you, and it makes sense. I don't know. I think about this a lot, and this is not a dig at all because she would accept this. But Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who's a professor at Harvard, coined the term "the politics of respectability," and she's very much about respectability politics. I feel like I have to dress up when I meet her. Like she is very much about that life. And I don't know. I see some people in the work that they study, in either whether they're studying family members or something that has, happened in their family, and now they study mass incarceration, or something that has been a trauma or something, and they're, they want to dig deeper. To be honest, though, I don't know why I study violence, because I'm really not a violent person, but there's something I'm intrigued about. I don't know.
Yeah.
I totally agree with that. That idea that history is biography in a lot of ways, meaning that it's the biography of the historian who's writing it. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily strongly identify with the people that they're writing about. We see this a lot with the folks who work on the far right? It's not like everyone's secret Nazis and Klansmen, but that there's something in their biography that really pushed them to study those particular topics. And you can take this too far, right? It's not a one-to-one correlation between somebody's life and what they study. But there are generally I would say almost always, if not always, hints to a person's personality and their interests and their experiences in their work.
I mean, everything at some level is projection, but also it is also you want people to work in stuff that they feel drawn to or called to, like every single field, right? That's like, it's the most basic advice, but it continues to be the truest advice. It's just like, just do what speaks to you. Don't do what other people think you should be doing, or don't do kind of stuff that you feel like is going to be for a wider audience, or just do the stuff that calls to you.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
Okay, wait. So something you mentioned earlier, I guess, folds into one of the next big questions that we got from a few people. But you talked a little bit about how you both sort of feel like you have a journalistic approach, and you try and marry sort of that sensibility with the academic work. And we got a few questions from people about sort of how you think about being public-facing historians. I mean, both of you are on several podcasts. You've done a bunch of projects. I think you're out there. You're writing op-eds. Well, I guess one question is kind of like, if you can speak in this way, like, where on the spectrum of public-facing historians do you see yourselves? I mean, I don't think either of you are like John Meacham, right? You're not, but like who I think has probably left most like academic history behind, right? Maybe I'm casting aspersions on John Meacham, but like where do you see yourself on that spectrum of public facing to academic, if that's even the right spectrum?
This is also a really interesting question, because there certainly are like those household names, and they tend to be white presidential historians. So Michael Beschloss and John Meacham and Doris Kearns Goodwin. There are also people like Skip Gates. But so there's kind of like the superstar level. And then there is kind of folks who are academic historians who are also doing public facing work. And I would say that I'm on the pretty far side of public facing. That's where my career was mostly situated. And now I'm in this place where that I have to renegotiate what that balance between academic historian and public facing historian look like, because I'm suddenly in this tenured professorship that just has a different set of incentives and has just a different balance in the kind of work that I will be doing.
And you're like building a program, right? So there's just a lot of
that's right.
Managerial stuff, internal managerial stuff
exactly.
Within the institution. Right?
Yeah, and the program is public facing, so it is a way to kind of institutionalize a lot of that work. But I'll also be in the classroom more and working on more scholarly projects.
Yeah, I would say if the superstars, like the ones who are solely public facing, are like 10. And then I'm thinking of like on a spectrum. Yeah. And then the ones who are purely academic, I only write in journals, I only read books that like 60 people read. It's like 1. I'm like 5, 6. I'm closer toward, I would say, the more public facing sector. But at the same time, I can fit in both worlds very easily. So I can go to an academic conference and do the academic speak thing and be very comfortable in that space. I can do the public facing work, whether it's TV or radio or podcast, and also be very comfortable in that space. But I will say that the public facing stuff is still a little bit newer to me because I don't know everyone's names. In my field, I know everybody that works on the abolitionists. I know everyone that works on, the 19th century or just about, or people that work on slavery or the Civil War. But the world of like journalism is so huge, I don't know everybody in sports journalism or fashion or, like all of the different offshoots of that. I know a lot of people who work in the 20th century or the colonial area or Asian history or European history, but it's I think it's harder to do that in a public-facing sector. It means you have to know a lot of people in order to be able to connect to a lot of different ideas. I think that's harder to get your hands around. And it gets slippery, especially when you start talking about like celebrity and fame and all that stuff. It gets a little slippery.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, Kelly, I feel like we've talked pretty frankly, especially, developing Operdemics, which happened this year. And you've talked about in doing that kind of work, wanting to maybe dial up that side a little bit for yourself and maybe turn that 5 into a 7 or an 8. So you have aspirations there. And I think, but also I think you've made a really compelling case. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how just like it feels like a necessary part of being an academic now. It's not just, I have a desire to be something else. It's more kind of like, this makes me a better academic. I need to be able to communicate to a wider audience.
Well, yeah, because I think that, if we're going to get dark, universities, colleges, they've become so corporate. And in becoming corporate, they have a desire to have a brand that people recognize. And so when they have scholars that are on Good Morning America or the Today Show or CNN or whatever it is, it heightens their own profile. And so they can appreciate scholars who have that kind of public facing work more and more. But it's not something that we've been trained to do, for sure. Yeah. And it's not something that in a lot of fields is accepted. The kind of work that I do, like for a podcast, I can't submit this day for tenure. They're not gonna accept, a podcast or an op-ed or whatever. But it has a value to it. And I think that's what the whole field is trying to reconcile with now, is how do we attach this public facing value and make it have capital, where you can put it on a CV and you can make it do work for you, similar work to the work that's done when you're writing for a journal or writing for an academic press.
What's so fascinating about this is that, 15 years ago, when I was first starting out, this kind of work was, I would say, looked at a little suspiciously. Yeah. Like if you were writing op-eds and things like that, there was a kind of question mark hovering over it. Like, why aren't you spending more time on your scholarship? Why are you wasting your time with this? And I think two things have changed. As Kelly was saying, universities have become more corporate. They have become much more interested in seeing their names in the New York Times or seeing their professors have brands that reinforce the university's brands. But also the profession has become much more precarious. And so you have a generation of scholars who are looking around thinking, how can I get noticed? How can I raise my profile and show that I can do more than the scholarship that I do? And so part of that is about standing out in a crowd, which becomes more difficult as everyone starts to become more public facing. But also, what is my lifeline going to be if I don't end up as a professor? So part of it too is creating other pathways and opportunities. So if you don't land a job, you can look in different related fields.
Yeah.
And Nikki and I both graduated Columbia in the same year, 2010, 2011. And we were still in the economic crisis. So you've got 200 people applying for 2 positions, you know, or maybe that's an exaggeration, but not so much. You had jobs in which 400 people, 300 people would apply for one job at one institution. And so you get down to the top 20, top 15, and everybody's got a book. And then out of that book, how many people have books plus articles, or how many people have TV time, radio time, whatever it is. The way they winnow down who becomes the candidate that gets the job is often about the person that has the most on their plate or the most on their CV, which is, an academic word for resume. But yeah.
So much of this is mirrored in the world of journalism and in the world of basically every field, which is this sort of tension, but I think at this point kind of a reconciled tension, just a new reality of individuals need to be their own, to lack of a better word, their own brand, and they need to be out there. And, there were the days when it was I remember when I was at WMIC, someone walking up to me and be like, why in the world would you want to be on Twitter? Why would you want to just put your name out there and write, thoughts in your name? It's well, first off, things to say, but also a little bit of sensing that same sort of thing. Journalism is cratering in the same way that academia was cratering and so forth. And it's you want to build up yourself. And then I think from an institutional perspective, I think largely institutions have come around to realizing that, like, no, actually it is good that, like, these individuals are out there and this institution gets tacked onto their name. That the New York Times is, like, famously now very okay with, like, all of their star reporters cutting deals with MSNBC and going on there because it just says, you know. But ESPN, I remember when I first got to ESPN, they had this rule that no one on ESPN could appear on any other network or podcast or whatever. And I was just like, this is such an antiquated approach and, you know, is going to cut off your nose to spite your face eventually, right? Because what you want is you want your people out there in as many places as possible. And then at the end of the interview, if they're really compelling, saying, oh, and this person has a podcast with ESPN or this person's a reporter with ESPN. Like, that's just the way of the world. You have to play that now. And this idea of siloing is just so antiquated.
And you can lose talent very quickly that way. I
Yes,
think about somebody,
for sure.
I feel like the tipping point was when Ezra Klein left the Washington Post. Like the Washington Post was kind of the one of the heights you could reach as a journalist in your career. And he was like, no, I'm going to go do my own thing. And he took his brand with him in a way
But of course, now he's at the Times, right? I mean, it's so funny how
But
how
I
these
think
things
about that
flow,
with
but
Rachel Maddow. She's like, I'm leaving to go podcast, you know?
Right,
Like,
yeah,
and people are like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like, but I think when you do establish a name for yourself, you can go wherever you want. And the hope is that your listeners will go with you. And I think that, you know, you can like cross-pollinate, you know, you can sort of like the podcast, the TV, the radio, the journalism, like however you want to mix it up. There are opportunities to do that.
Yeah. And, you know, to state the obvious, but it's worth saying out loud, you know, I think not everyone should be there sort of a brand of one and floating around and is in a position and in a sort of privileged position to be able to freelance and pull this off. And there like absolutely need to be institutions that are supported from top to bottom and well funded, and there should be like, you know, like some people want to do anonymous work inside of an institution and have stability, and like the fact that there's opportunity from that cratering happening does not mean that cratering is a good thing at all. And so, you know, I think both academia and journalism and a lot of other fields, you know, are a lot of this is a reflection of the fact that they are in crisis in many ways and need to sort of chart what comes next. One last thing related to this. This is a question I have, but do you have students coming into your classrooms sort of knowing you from a public facing perspective, saying, "Oh, I've listened to your shows, or I've read your op-eds or whatever"? And how does that affect your kind of just like in the classroom relationship with students?
Yes and no. Most of my students have heard me speak before, like give a lecture or seen a YouTube or something like that, and have wanted to come to my class. But most of the referrals are like other students who've taken my class saying, oh my gosh, you got to take Professor Carter Jackson's class. Like they trust, like, because for them, it's not like, is she a superstar? It's so how long do the papers have to be? Like, what is the workload? What is the workload like? What is, you know, can I do well in her class? You know, that kind of thing. But every now and then I do get a few students who have listened to a podcast or have seen something I've done before. But I don't know, it's different. Today's students, you know, they don't watch TV, you know, like they're not, their world is TikTok, and I'm not on TikTok, you know, like their world is just different from mine. So I would say their parents might have more an affinity than the students themselves.
You know, it's interesting. When I was last teaching, I was teaching at the University of Miami until 2015. My public-facing career was just starting to take off. So my experience with students was much like Kelly's, where it's kind of the word of mouth. You start to have students who really like your classes and so continue to take your classes. But it was starting to like burble up, where students will have read an op-ed that I had written, and we would talk about it a little bit after class. I'm actually really interested to see what the dynamic is going to be. I gave a guest lecture here at Vanderbilt, and a student came up afterwards and said that she was a This Day listener. We talked about Polly Murray, who was somebody who we talked about on the show, who she hadn't heard of before. And we were both just like, how is it that this amazing person was somehow not part of our education, not part of her education as a law student? and having that sort of like shared sense of discovery and having something to talk about that was related to her education, but also related to the work that, well, the three of us do here, which was, who knows if that's a one-off or will become a more common experience. But I thought that I'd share that because that was pretty cool.
That is cool.
I expect that to happen more.
I hope it happens more.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. We'll do some lighter ones and some faster ones here. Very quick. Someone asked, who does the theme music for the show? And I will answer that. But basically, I don't know if people know there's this music library called Blue Dot Sessions. A lot of podcasts use it. You've probably heard our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. And it's a library that writes a bunch of interesting music that then you can license largely for podcasts. I found a song on there back when we were coming up with this show. I was very into whistling at the time. I was like, I want something that was catchy and whistling, and it'll get people hooked. But then I took that, and it wasn't exactly right. And so I took it to a musician who our buddy Rishikesh Hirway had recommended, this guy who calls himself Teen Days. He lives in Vancouver. And I sort of gave it to him. I was like, can you just remix this a little bit, maybe add some beats, rework it, mostly just keep the whistling, but also add some other stuff. So it is like a Teen Days remix of a library cut from Blue Dot Sessions. And it is also available. We get emails from this every couple weeks or so. It is on our website. You can download it there if for some reason you want that track just without us talking over it. But and do check out Teen Days. He's great. And there's a link to his work on our site as well. Well, we fished for this on the last episode, so I guess we got to do it. But Nikki, tell us about your dog.
My dog. My dog is the most wonderful dog in the world. I know that other dog owners will disagree, but in your case, she will be the second greatest dog in the world. I have wanted a pup for a really long time, and so much of my life has been on the road in the past several years. I haven't had a ton of stability, and I had just taken this job at Columbia where I was going to be traveling 2 weeks out of the month, and there was no way that I could have a pet in those circumstances. Enter the pandemic, sort of deus ex machina that comes in to make it possible for me to get a pup. And when it became clear that my job at Columbia was going to be done entirely over Zoom, I was like, all right, now is the time, pulling the trigger, getting a dog. And I found, so Nala is a Havanese poodle mix. She's hypoallergenic. And she came into my life in April of 2021. And I just love her to pieces. Here are the things to know about her. She is a terrible flyer.
Okay.
My apologies to everyone who was on that flight. Didn't know it was going to go like that. She's not going to get on a plane again. She's an excellent car tripper. So she does very good in her little seat in the front of my car. And she's a very selective listener. She knows exactly how to do tricks when there are treats in my hands, and when there are not, she is uninterested in doing anything that I say. And she's also an excellent snuggler. She sleeps on the bed. She keeps me warm at night.
How does she like Nashville?
She loves it because, she spent the first part of her life in New York City where she was mostly on concrete. So now she knows what grass is. She's very excited about that. And she knows what squirrels are. She likes those a lot better than the rats in New York. Mm-hmm. She thinks that they will be her friends. And so she firmly believes that one day she will get off leash and get to play with a squirrel and they will become best buddies.
Okay, so that's part 1 of our Ask Us Anything episode. We will be back next episode with part 2. We'll start it off with some lighter of your questions. We'll have some fun. But thanks for listening. And once again, Happy New Year. We'll see you next episode for part 2.
Radiotopia.